As we approach the 100th day of his presidency, President Biden is enjoying broad support for his agenda, which has many progressives seeing him as a transformational president. It's an argument made by Anand Giridharadas in a New Atlantic article entitled, "Welcome to the New Progressive Era." But many on the right don't see it that way. The National Review's Ramesh Ponnuru says that for all of the Democrats' ambitions to transform the country, there's not a lot of transformation underway. And Ramesh and Anand join us now to talk about this. I'm so confused.
I am too.
What's happening?
But you know what? That's not unusual for me, being so confused. Ramesh, let's start with you. So you write in your piece brilliantly that it's in the Republicans and the Democrats' best interest to suggest there's this great progressive transformation going on. But you're not buying into it. Why? And Ramesh is frozen. It looks like, Anand, this is going to be a debate that you're going to enjoy. We're going to let you talk about why you think there is, have been.
I like my chances suddenly. Yeah.
they just went up at least 5%. So, Anand, why don't you tell us what I think most people are saying right now, at least in Democratic circles, that this is a big progressive push, and Joe Biden's exceeding expectations on that front, and we'll try to get Ramesh back. Go ahead, Anand.
You know, I don't think Joe Biden is, as a matter of persona, a transformational figure. I think the country has been transformed by reality. I think the facts of America have changed the American consensus. And Joe Biden's role in this is one that I really admire, but it's not necessarily the role of a transformer. It's the role of someone who is persuadable by a changing reality, which not a lot of us are. A lot of us are too proud to change, to recognize that the conventional wisdom in which we were steeped is different. Joe Biden's role here, to me, is as someone who has recognized that the age of Reagan we've been living in since 1981, the year of my birth. I don't take responsibility for it, however. The assumption that government is the problem, as Reagan said in that inaugural address in that year, the assumption that government is kind of regrettable, that the market is always best at solving all types of problems. That basic spell has been with us for these 40 years. There have been Republicans who've won in that era. There have been Democrats who've won in that era. But all of them have been in that spell. So Bill Clinton has to say the era of big government is over. I'm not sure he bled in his heart for that phrase, but he had to say it as a Democrat living in a Republican's age. And what I think is happening now in 2021 is the breaking of that spell by reality. I don't think most Americans watching this think of government as the main problem anymore. They've been perhaps sideswiped by the 2008 crisis. Government was not the problem in the 2008 crisis. They've been hit by rising inequality, not paid enough. I don't think government is the problem for them in that situation. Their health care is threadbare. The insurance companies deny their claims. I don't think government is the problem for them. And now in COVID, the ultimate test of the only solutions are things we do together, not do alone. I don't think Americans think of government as the problem as they're getting those shots in the arm. And so Joe Biden has, I think, responded to a new operating consensus that has been fought for, as always, by people on the margins, people on the fringes, activists who have shifted the sense of the normal. And I think we're on the brink of a new progressive era, as I said, not in the middle of one yet.
Let's get Ramesh in here. Ramesh, I think we have you back here. What say you?
Well, I think that Anand is right in capturing the sort of zeitgeist of the Biden administration. But I think that we heard a lot of the same things about the public having fundamentally rejected Reaganite conservatism back when Barack Obama was getting inaugurated and passing his stimulus. And I just wonder whether this is going to turn out to be any truer this time than it was that time. Of course, that was in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis, when a lot of people thought that people's views about markets and competition and regulation might have changed forever, and they just didn't. Right now, we're seeing a Democratic administration with a Democratic Congress that is showing that it can spend a lot of money, But in terms of actually passing the legislation that Democrats really want, I think we're going to see a lot of disappointments pile up. We've already seen the $15 minimum wage get tossed in the dustbin. We're going to see that again with increasing the number of states. People who want an expanded Supreme Court, they're going to get a commission instead. And I think if you just go down the list, assault weapons ban, another thing that is just not going to happen in this Congress. This is a very, very tightly divided Congress. They've got the narrowest Democratic margin in the House since the Rutherford B. Hayes administration. And the idea that we're going to see this big left-wing juggernaut out of Washington, D.C., that's something that excites Democrats. It's something that scares Republicans. And so both parties want to talk about it, but I don't know if it's actually going to happen.
So, Ramesh, let me talk about what we were talking about earlier this morning when I said it looked like we were moving beyond the Reagan era. I agree with you that after Barack Obama was elected, you look at the headlines, you look at the editorials in the days after, it was much like the editorials that you would have read, say, following Goldwater's defeat in 1964, predicting the death of the modern conservative movement in America. Same editorials were written in 2009. But look at the public opinion polls that we've seen now. 75% of Americans supporting a COVID relief bill that neither you nor I, nor Steve Ratner, nor Larry Summers would support because we believe it spends too much. It spends more than actually was taken from the economy, but very popular with the American people. The same thing with this transportation bill, the same thing with raising taxes on corporations, the same thing with raising taxes on people making over $400,000. I didn't see that in 2009. I saw the Tea Party begin to emerge. So when you see those numbers, what do you take away from that?
Well, I do think that spending is if you want to make the case that progressivism has running room, spending is the place where it has that. Partly that's because of the way the Senate works and the fact that you can pass spending bills with just a bare majority. And partly I think it's because the Republicans have lost their credibility on spending issues and have lost their interest in constraining spending based on their record during the Bush and Trump years. That kind of tactic on the Republican side has kind of played out. On taxes, though, look at the corporate tax rate. We're talking about a Trump tax cut that took that from 35% to 21%. And now Democrats with Joe Manchin on board want to take it all the way back up to 25%. That is to say, leaving most of the Trump rate reduction for corporations in place. That is not a left-wing revolution. It may be a bad idea. It may be a good idea. But I don't think it is the end of Reaganism.
Anand, I'll let you reply to that directly, but also want to ask you about something we were talking about earlier, which is the surprise, frankly, of many of the most progressive members of Congress at just how progressive Joe Biden has been, specifically in that $1.9 trillion package that went through to address COVID relief, but embedded within it. I know you talked to Congresswoman Ilhan Omar for your piece, embedded poverty-fighting measures as well, that they were surprised made it in the final version.
Yeah, and first of all, I want to say, article number one of evidence in the era of progress dawning is that you and Joe and Mika now say my name more accurately than Ramesh did, of all people, of all the people that betray me on that.
Known you a long time, Anand. Yeah.
I know. So, I think part of what I think about, I'm not a policy guru the way, maybe I should be, but I think a lot about cultural waves. And to me, the new thing that is happening right now is the ship of received wisdom turning. And the issue you raise is one great example of that. Since the 60s, since the civil rights era, there has been this reluctance on the part of Democrats to talk about the poor. And in some ways, Joe Biden's rhetoric in recent decades was an example of that. It was always the middle class, middle class, middle class, middle class. I like the middle class. I'm Joe Biden. I like the middle class. That was emblematic of Democrats wanting to sound, particularly white working class voters, like they're the party of the middle class. They're not helping some undeserving poor welfare queen fantasy that the Reaganites concocted. And that has shifted. I spoke to, for my piece in The Atlantic, Reverend William Barber, who leads the Poor People's Campaign, and he's done this for a long time. And he says, look, they are talking about poverty, centering poverty, using the word poverty, installing these benefits for low-income parents. and various other ways. And that's just one example of the way in which I think the terms of the debate have shifted. So I don't think that there's that much daylight necessarily between Ramesh and my diagnosis of how far this guy has gone so far. That's not really what I'm saying. I am talking about, I will say, even on this show, having been on this show several years, the argument Joe and I might have had about capitalism and government 6 years ago is different than the one we have today, because I think reality has changed. You know, I think there's a growing recognition that the American dream is fantastic, but it's a shame that it only exists in Europe. And there's a growing desire to import it back into the United States.
Come on. No, baby. No, we don't agree that much. Anand, we don't agree that much. But I do think, though, Anand, really quickly, just to follow up on that, you know, when you have people like Alan Greenspan saying several years ago that income disparity is a threat to American capitalism, I think that's something that a lot of even libertarians/conservatives now recognize.
Absolutely. And I think that, in a way, that's how countries change, right? Not when the same pitch from the same group, you know, is continuing to preach to the choir, but when some of those arguments cross over. And for someone like you, Joe, you know, the idea of mobility stalling in this country, the idea that people actually don't get where their talents should take them just by working hard. That's the kind of thing that might change your mind in a way that some kind of human rights argument for healthcare might not. And that's good. That's why I think the terms of the debate have shifted, because reality has intruded on some of the narratives that we have in this country. Some of the narratives around the fact that we're the place where, you know, your dreams are the only limit on your rise. Well, I think more and more Americans know that's just not the case for a whole lot of people watching this.
Hey, thanks so much for watching our YouTube channel. You can follow up on today's top stories and breaking news, or catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.